Thank you for being here. So it's time. This is our final panel. And I'm here just to give you a brief introduction of the fantastic speakers that we'll have right now. First of all, we'll have Merritt B. Fox. He's our moderator. He's also Michael E. Patterson Professor of Law and the NASDAQ Professor for the Law and Economics of Capital Markets at Columbia Law School. We'll also have Eliana Broso Quimenti. She's partner at the Brazilian law firm Machado Meia Sendex Iopes Advogados. We have also Guilherme Fernandes Cook. He's partner at the Brazilian law firm Velozes Giroto Advogados Associados. Also, we have André Pita. He's the Legal Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs at B3 Brasil Bolsa Balcão. We have also Lyle Schwartz. He's the head of Equity Capital Markets at Goldman Sachs. And David Tyler, he's counsel at Hogan Lovells. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. So it's great to have everyone introduced, and as you can tell from the program, this last session deals with recent developments in capital markets in Brazil. So we're going to try and get a sense of what the recent offerings have been, what kind of recent regulatory changes have occurred, a looking forward to what the market looks like over the next year or next few years, the role of funds, and just looking at perhaps how the integration of U.S. and Brazilian capital markets could develop over time, and what might be appropriate regulatory changes to encourage that. Eliana, I think as we've worked things out, you are going to be first and talk a little bit about what the markets have looked like recently, what kinds of offerings have succeeded.
Okay, thank you, Professor Fox. I would like to thank you, Columbia Law School, and the organizers, in particular Karina, for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor for me to be part of this panel and of this event. I will start talking about some data of financing and capital markets in Brazil. According to IBMEC, one well-known college in Brazil, report of 2016, equity markets in Brazil is much more developed than debt market, although debt instruments have grown much more in the last years. Shares and corporate securities represent roughly 10% of the private financing in Brazil. So this shows that there is a high potential for growth in terms of issuance of securities for Brazilian companies. Approximately 22% of the total financing, current and non-current, of Brazilian companies are raised through the issuance of corporate debt instruments. In terms of size of markets, just to give you an idea, USA is the first market in the world in terms of market capitalization, with $19 trillion. And Brazil is the ninth with $816 billion, which is equivalent to the value of some huge US listed companies. In terms of number of listed companies, Canada is the first country with 3,699 listed companies. US is the second with more than 2,000, and Brazil is the 10th with 350 listed companies. In terms of, just to sum the growth history of our capital markets, from 1995 to 2003, there were 90 IPOs in Brazil. At that time, IPOs occurred simultaneously in Brazil and in the US as a way to provide liquidity to the securities. And IPOs were also restricted to huge Brazilian companies, such as Aracruz, which was the first Brazilian company to issue ADRs. From 2004 on, there was the beginning of a virtual cycle in Brazil due to especially the high corporate governance standards, more stringent regulation and self-regulation, and also our better economic environment. In 2007, equity offerings in Brazil raised 116 billion reais. There were, in 2007, 58 IPOs, 12 follow-ons, and 6 BDR offerings. In this same year, 2007, Brazil ranked fifth in IPOs in terms of financial volume, following New York, London, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. In 2008, Brazil earned the investment grade, also lost it in 2015, 2016. But as a result of the loss of the investment grade, issuance of debt instruments by Brazilian companies fell deeply in international markets, from 6.5 billion in 2015 as compared to 27.1 billion in 2014. We saw a recovery in 2016 when the amount of debt instruments issued by Brazilian companies reached 17.3 billion, which represents roughly 7% of the average between 2010 and 2014. One of the main factors that hinders the development of Brazilian capital markets is our continuous high interest rates. And just to give you an example, someone that invested 1,000 reais when our currency was created in 1995 would have more than 42,000 reais in 2016 compared to 14 who had invested in government bonds, as opposed to 14,000 reais if invested in a portfolio that follows the index of our stock exchange. So, as you can see, it's very difficult to compete with government bonds. To make a security attractive in Brazilian capital markets is indeed a challenge. So issuance of equity and debt instruments should respond positively to the reduction of the interest rates and also as a result of the reducing of financing at low rates, especially by BNDES, the Brazilian the National Development Bank. The risk that we foresee to start seeing these positive results is the Brazilian political scenario and also an eventual increase of the interest rate in the United States. And the recent story, the recent history of success of Brazilian capital markets is mainly attributable to the evolution of our regulation. And change about the regulation, as said here, once we have just 10 minutes, I will be for sure be superficial here, but just to give you an idea of the recent changes in our regulation that we believe will propel the development of our market. First of all, I will mention the amendments to the special corporate governance segments of our stock exchange. Now the name changed recently, so it's B3. It's difficult for me after so many years to say B3, but it's B3. And the segments are now under a restricted audience by the listed companies, and they have some controversial points. I will cite only 3 of them due to the time constraints, but they are the ones that I believe it's worth mentioning. That is the creation of a quorum to the list from the special segments. According to the current rules, there is no quorum. It's enough that a company launches a tender offer, and then, irrespective of the quorum that approved the listing or accept the offering, the company can delist from the segments. The idea now is to establish a minimum 40% of the free float to approve the delisting from the special segments. Another controversial point is a tag-along in case of acquisition of a relevant stock holding between 20 and 30%. In case someone acquires this range in the market, it's obliged to launch a tag-along tender offer. And another point is the establishment of the audit committee. And in relation to this point, the concern of the Brazilian listed company is that in case they were listed both in Brazil and in the US, they need to conciliate the rules of the special segment with, for instance, the rules of the Sarbanes-Oxley. And this is a challenge to conciliate such rules. In addition to the proposal of amendments to the special segment rules, it's cited mentioning a rule, CVM Rule 476, which is equivalent to the 144A, to Rule 144A, which also contributes a lot to the development of the capital markets in Brazil, once it allows Brazilian companies to issue securities without registration before the CVM. Closed companies may issue debentures and offer it to the public. Publicly held companies registered as Category A may issue shares and also distribute it to the public without registration before the CVM, but as occurs in Rule 144A, only the so-called professional investors, according to Brazilian regulation, may acquire such securities. And underwriters can only contact up to 75 professional investors, and the securities can be subscribed or acquired for a maximum of 50 professional investors. And there is a lockup of 90 days for such securities being traded in the stock exchange or in the over-the-counter market. Recently, such rule was amended to allow that BDRs level 1 and 2 may also be offered with these restricted selling efforts. Before this enactment of the rule, only BDRs level 3 could be offered according to instruction CVM 476. And finally, I would like to mention the Brazilian Code of Corporate Governance as another initiative to propel the development of our market. This code was enacted in November 2016, is now under public hearing before CVM, just to decide the best way for listed companies to comply with the code. If they will if the code will be part of a separate document or will be part of the annual report that Brazilian companies are obliged to file before the CVM. And the idea, this code, it's important to say, is in the model apply or explain. So the companies must explain in case they do not comply with some provisions of the code. The code is mandatory as of January 2018 for the companies that are part to the index of B3. and for all publicly held company as of January 2016, and must be filed with CVM within 6 months after the end of the fiscal year. And again, in relation to this code, some companies are quite critical about it due to the excess of rules, and again, the way to conciliate the rules of the code with other rules, including the ones of the proposed amendments to the special corporate segments. So these were the points that I had to raise here, and please.
Well, thank you. I feel considerably updated. Andre, I believe you're going to tell us something about the recent changes in the capital markets in terms of the merger of the different institutions, specifically between Bovespa and CETIP, and what you think that implies.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank CLS Brazil and Columbia Law School for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to start speaking a little bit about the creation of B3. First of all, I think it's necessary to explain what is B3. People are asking, what does it mean, B3? It is easier to explain in Portuguese, but B3 references to 3 words in Portuguese. Brazil, this one is easy, Brazil. The second one is bolsa, which is a Portuguese word for exchange in the sense of a stock exchange or a derivative exchange. And the third one, which is balcão, it would be something close to OTC platform or OTC market in Portuguese. So that's the reason of the B3, the 3 words related to activities that are now managed by the company. So B3 is the company resulting from the merger between BM&F Bovespa and CETIP. BM&F Bovespa itself was already the result of another merger, the merger between BM&F, which was the derivatives exchange operator and the central counterpart operator for derivatives market in Brazil, and Bovespa, which was the former São Paulo Stock Exchange, basically the stock exchange and central counterpart and central securities depository for the equity markets. And CETIP, on the other hand, was the major OTC platform and trade repository and central securities depository for fixed income securities, for banking instruments, and also the major OTC, the major trade repository for OTC derivatives without CCP clearing in Brazil. In May 2016, the shareholders of both companies approved the merger, which was approved by the antitrust authorities and the securities regulator last March, allowing the creation of B3, which is now a major financial market infrastructure in Brazil, holding business on trading, post-trading, listed companies listing, and it is now among the 5th and the 6th biggest exchange operator in the world in terms of capital, market capitalization. We can say that B3 now holds basically 5 major business segments. One of them is for listed products, such as equity derivatives, including all the chain for the listed products market, listing, trading, post-trading, CCP, CSD services. The second one is for OTC derivatives, acting as a trade repository for OTC derivatives and also a settlement system for OTC derivatives, including CCP for some of those products, which is one of the efficiencies brought by the transaction, the possibility to increase the number of OTC derivatives subject to CCP clearing. The other one is related to corporate fixed income, also trading and post-trading. The same for banking instruments, which in Brazil are subject to mandatory registration before a trade repository in some cases. And the last one is related to the support to some financing transactions, especially for the acquisition of vehicles and real estate, which in Brazil is also subject to some specific regulation regarding their registration and disclosure of these transactions, also through a system which is similar to a trade repository. So those are basically the business that are now under B3. There is an important commitment of the company with the market community, including clients, intermediaries, and the regulators, in order to keep the high standard of services of the technological infrastructure and self-regulation that both BMNF, Bovespa, and CETIP were used to provide. So for now on, all the services, they are going to be provided the same way they were used to be. Of course, that the company is accessing all the benefits and all the opportunities that may arise from the combination of the business, but considering that both companies were under strict anti-gun jumping rules because of the merger review of the transaction, this work is starting now. So basically, I think those were the highlights that I want to mention about the creation and B3. And in addition to that, I think it's also worth to mention some of the recent initiatives that we are having in Brazil in securities regulation. Eliana mentioned some of them. We saw in Brazil in the last few years a very intense agenda of rulemaking by our securities regulator in a lot of different themes, such as proxy voting, disclosure of corporate reorganization transactions, investment funds, private equity funds, real estate funds. And I would like to briefly mention two initiatives that are more related to a broad agenda of our regulator together with the private sector in order to enhance and to boost capital formation through the Brazilian capital markets, especially by small and medium companies. So the rule that Eliana just mentioned, the amendment to CVM Rule 476, in order to include in the limited offer regime that we had in Brazil, equity securities, was part of that, initiative. It is a regulation that in some ways is similar to what you have here in the US, in a mix maybe between Regulation D and 144A, as Eliana mentioned, with one important difference, which is that it is available only for public companies, only for reporting companies. So when you say it is similar to Reg D, for example, we have to stress that because it is an important difference. And although it was created within the scope of this broad agenda of enhancing capital formation and IPOs for small and medium companies, what we see up to now is that this rule has been used much more as a fast-track regime for follow-on offers in Brazil than as a mechanism for access of newcomers to our capital markets. And in the end of the day, it solved a gap that we had in Brazil for several years regarding a fast-track regime or a shelf registration regime for follow-on offers. So it is working very well on that perspective. In the last, in 2016, we had 9 follow-ons in Brazil. 7 of them were made through this regulation. And this year, we already had 3, and all of them were made through this regulation. So, of course, it is good to have a regulation that solves this problem. But on the other hand, we also have to be a little concerned about what maybe is still missing in order to facilitate or to enhance capital formation for small and medium companies in Brazil, once this was one of the aims of this regulation. And that brings me to the second topic that I want to briefly mention, which is the equity crowdfund regulation in Brazil. As many other jurisdictions, we are in Brazil about to have an equity crowdfunding regulation. This regulation was subject to a public hearing made by CVM, which ended up last year. Up to now in Brazil, we don't have any kind of specific regulation for equity crowdfunding, although we already have some very active equity crowdfunding platforms operating in Brazil. And those transactions up to now, they're being made based on a very old exemption that we have in our regulation for what we call micro or small companies, which are basically companies with an annual revenue of up to 4.8 million reais, which is approximately $1.5 million. And the proposed rule by CVM for equity crowdfunding in some way expand this regime. So the regulation that were proposed sets for a regime of exemption for those transactions, exemption from registration before CVM, and also an exemption related to the compliance of the full disclosure regime, as it is common in this kind of regulation in other jurisdictions. It will apply to companies with an annual revenue of up to 10 million reais, which is something close to $3.2 million. The issuer may offer securities in an amount of up to 5 million reais per year, something close to $1.5 million. They also want to include sort of investment cap for retail investors. So a retail investor is going to be allowed only to invest up to 10,000 reais, something close to $3.2 thousand, considering all the transactions that they participate. There are going to be some specific disclosure obligations for those enterprises, although they are not reporting companies. They are not going to be registered before CVM. And maybe the most important part of the regulation, which is the registration of the crowdfunding platforms before CVM, which is something that is also common in this kind of regulation. They are going to be subject to CVM regulation. They're going to require. They're going to have to require for an authorization. They are going to be subject to a lot of obligations, including some specific due diligence obligation over the securities that are offered through the platform. So, in somehow those platforms, they are considered as the most important gatekeeper in this kind of transaction, and they are subject to some obligation that are close to an intermediary in some way. So we have to wait now for the enactment of the rule and see if it can really helps in this capital formation initiative in Brazil. So I think those were the topics that I wanted to comment, and again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And Lyle, can you tell us a little bit about your general sense of sort of the demand for Brazilian offerings at this point, and in particular among finance in the U.S.?
Sure, absolutely. And Professor Fox, thank you, and thank you to Columbia Law School for inviting me here today. I'm honored to be here with you. You know, the capital market story as it relates to Brazil right now is actually a pretty exciting one, and it's a true turnaround story. It really got. I think we had an inflection point as the impeachment proceedings came to a conclusion, or September last year, and with that behind us, and with the promise of growth returning to Brazil, the capital markets, as they typically do, begin to perform. And Brazil, as I'm sure many of you know, Brazil was one of the best performing capital markets in 2016, with the market up some 40% in local currency and nearly 70% in US dollar terms. And so that kind of activity and excitement from the stock market has actually re-energized investors and issuers, and has resulted in significant capital already being issued, both at the end of last year and probably more importantly this year. So as investors think about Brazil, I'm going to come on in a second and take you through some of those offerings, but as investors think about Brazil, they are upbeat and optimistic and forward-looking. They're hopeful that the business cycle has reached an inflection point, that inflation, importantly, is beginning to recede and come down within a reasonable band, and that growth will return this year. And our own economist is forecasting about 60 basis points of positive GDP growth for this year, going to 2.6% GDP growth in 2018 and 2.7% in 2019. We're also forecasting interest rates, and we've seen this already play out this year, but interest rates essentially going from the current 11.25% down to below 9%. And that also is very favorable for stock markets and equity issuance. So, what's happened in terms of specific issuance? This year we've seen $6 billion of equity issuance from Latin America. 75% of that has come from Brazil, so about $4.6 billion of total issuance. We've also seen a return of an IPO market in Brazil. There have been 4 significant IPOs greater than $50 million that have listed this year. And to put that in, raising $1.3 billion, to put that in context, for the prior 3 years, there was no more than around $200 million of IPO issuance of significant issuers, and approximately 1 or 2 deals per year. So we've already seen 4 deals through. So far. Yeah, so far this year, and I'll come on. There's a vast pipeline of IPOs that are in the preparatory phase and hope to come. I think an attractive bunch will come before the summer, the North American summer, so before the end of July, and then more in the second half. There's also been a lot of press around that. You may have read a pretty interesting article in the New York Times that sort of profiled the return of the Brazilian IPO market and some of the issuers that might come. So what kind of issuance have we seen? What kind of companies? And who's participating? So as I mentioned, 4 IPOs, Hermes Pardini, diagnostics business, Netshoes, an e-commerce business, sports, fashion, and sports apparel and fashion, Azul, an airline, discount airline, and Movida, a rental or leasing business. On the follow-on side, we've also seen 4 transactions, equally varied by sector. CCR, toll road business, Lojas Americana, retailer, Banco Santander, which was a sell down by QIA, the Qatar sovereign fund, so financials. And Alipar, which is a energy or power utility. So pretty vast and diverse companies. For the most part, these transactions have been met with significant support. The support is certainly mixed, and to your specific question, there has been a lot of support in these transactions from U.S. investors. There's a general comfort. We mentioned all of the sophistication of the stock market and also of the regulations and the corporate governance. There is a unanimous comfort with Brazil as a capital market by both domestic and international investors, and they've been participating in size in these offerings. What I would say, and this has been consistent over the years, but it tends to be the larger offerings that actually attract more international capital. And so, transactions by the likes of, a CCR, which raised over $1 billion, had, over 70% of that offering placed with international investors, U.S. investors being, a large part of that. Logis Americana, another one, raised nearly $800 million, and about half of that transaction was placed international investors, the other half onshore. Some of the smaller deals, so be it Movida or Hermes Pardini, probably more like 20 to 30% was placed offshore. And interestingly, in the case of Netshoes, which was a transaction that we at Goldman Sachs led, the overwhelming majority of the deal was actually placed offshore. This was a transaction that was listed solely in the United States on the New York Stock Exchange. The first time at IPO that a company is listed, solely in the United States, and that offering was largely purchased by U.S. and international buyers. So I think, in summary, the market is back. It is 75% of all the issuance that has come from Latin America. It's poised to have a record year, certainly relative to the prior 5 years in terms of issuance. And it's bringing new IPOs, a new healthy IPO market where deals are getting done successfully, and it's attracting international capital as well as support from local investors. And as it relates to perception and governance and concerns about corruption and those types of things, investors are selecting companies on a stock-by-stock basis, bottom-up perspective, and are willing to put dollars to work in Brazil to support these companies.
Great, thank you so much. Guilherme, can you tell us a little bit about the role of funds, both domestically and international, in terms of Brazilian finance?
Of course, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here until now. I think it's a long seminar, so probably most of you are tired. Thank you for the patience. I would also like to thank Guilherme for the invitation. We've spent a few years working together. It was a pleasure to do that. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, would like to thank my girlfriend for being here with me and for supporting me on this trip and making a business trip one of the best weeks of my life. So now, answering to your question, I think that what was
now you have the important things.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the frivolities. But basically, what we have been talking about here, and the question that was brought to me was, due to the fact that the Brazilian funds right now are investing more abroad, and I'll talk a little bit about this, if a cross-border regulation would be interesting for the fund industry. And when I started thinking about this cross-border regulation, because of this new relationship that the Brazilian funds have by investing abroad, my answer was no. And my answer was no because I don't think that we have room right now in the world, or we have room right now in the markets to have cross-border regulations. We still have very different legal systems. And one of the main issues that we have been facing from a Brazilian standpoint is what is exactly an investment fund when you look abroad. Why am I telling that? Because basically, in Brazil, I don't know if all of you guys are aware of that, but an investment fund is a condominium. So it basically just like your building's condominium. It doesn't have a legal personality by itself. Because of that, the role of the players in the Brazilian investment fund is completely different. When you look at a U.S. fund, a Cayman fund, the first thing that you need to understand is that that fund is a corporation or a company by itself. So it has a legal nature of a company with limited liability. The administrator, which is the guy that basically calculates the NAV of the fund and do the register and transfer agency, which are basically these roles of bringing the investors and calculating the net asset values of the fund. In offshore funds, they are basically service providers. In Brazil, the administrator has a completely different role because as the fund is a condominium, as the fund is not a legal entity by itself, he is the legal representative of this vehicle. This brings to the Brazilian industry a lot of protection. So, and some different types of protection that I don't think I need to get deep here, but the point is that we have a very protective industry. By having a very protective industry, and thinking about the inflow of monies from outside for investment in Brazil, our industry was always safe. I don't know if everyone knows that, but in Brazil there is no OTC. In Brazil, everything needs to be custodied, everything needs to be at B3 when a fund is investing, when a Brazilian fund is investing. Because of that, the counterparty risks, as an example, for an investment fund in Brazil is completely different from the counterparty risk of an investment fund in the US, which, again, this is a defense of our markets. We have a very safe fund structure. Because of that, what I think it's the main challenge that we are now facing is, as I said before, what is an investment fund when we look abroad? Because for the past 10 years, the main regulation for the Brazilian liquid investment funds, and by liquid investment funds I mean those that are the multi-market funds, the public equities funds, the fixed income funds, which are basically monies. For these type of funds, we have been for the past 10 years allowing even the retail investors to have a portion of the NAV of the fund invested abroad. So in 2007, it started with 10%, then it came to 20%, now we are 40%, even 100% depending on the type of investor that you have. But what CVM brings us is a lot of demands on which is the type of investment fund that you can invest abroad from a safety purpose, from a structural purpose. And when we start to make this match, when you start to compare what is a Brazilian fund and what is an offshore fund, the first thing that we have to deal with is the fact that there are different legal entities. They have different legal natures. The setup of the protections is completely different. Because of these differences, I think that I've been thinking about basically 3 standpoints for this discussion. As I said, for the inflow of monies, offshore investors always invested in Brazilian funds, not because of their safety, but because of tax exemptions. When you invest in Brazil through funds, you usually have tax exemptions for these foreign investors. But think as Brazilian investors and Brazilian funds investing abroad, we have now 3 different standpoints that I would like to discuss. The first one is, and this is more from a tax perspective than a regulatory perspective, is the discussion about individuals in Brazil that invest in exclusive funds abroad. We had this law that was passed a few years ago, and we had this big discussion because over there in Brazil, even though we are a positive system, we are now discussing substance and form. So a lot of what we have learned in our life doesn't work as we used to learn, as it used to be before. But there's a lot of discussion on substance. So whenever these ultra high net worth individuals in Brazil invest abroad, they usually set up companies, and these companies were the ones making its personal investments. So for this first perspective, the individual that set up a fund, an international fund, we have been discussing with the IRS what is an actual fund for the purposes of taxing the Brazilian investor when it sends its money abroad and brings it back. And again, this is the first moment when you have the IRS, when you have CVM, when you have the Brazilian attorneys saying, what is a fund abroad? Should it be a condominium? Can it be a corporation? Is the fact that this fund abroad is a company, does it bring you to a different situation of not investing in a fund, but investing in a company? The tax treatment for investing in a company and investing in a fund abroad are different. The tax treatment for investing in a fund is better. You pay almost, you basically pay 15% on the capital, on the capital gains when you bring the money back. And at a company, it comes from 25.5 to 15, depending on what you're doing. But basically, you have this discussion from a tax perspective, and having this discussion from a tax perspective, you need to try to think how the IRS guy is going to think when he investigates your structure. And when he investigates your structure, we usually assume that he's not going to consider the legal entity or the legal nature of the fund in order to assess if you have an investment in a fund or in a company. Because when you treat these investments, and I think it's important to say that, when you're investing in a company abroad, and this company abroad only has financial assets, we have been dealing with some decisions from the Brazilian IRS that says the following. This company that you have has no substance, it's not a company itself, so you should have not set it up, or you should have not treated it fiscally from the perspective that you did. So they basically disregard the company, and they say that you should have taxed each investment per se. So the exception that we had on the law was, okay, so if you have an investment fund, you're not going to have this problem. And then from a tax perspective comes the question, what is an investment fund when we look abroad? The only place that we also have funds structured as condominium is Bahamas. We have the ICON fund in Bahamas. The ICON fund is the result of the discussion of what is a fund abroad. This was created right at the time when we were with this menace of having the Brazilian government taxing these private investment companies that the wealthy investors in Brazil used to have. So this is the first place where we see the discussion, how can I see a structure abroad as an investment fund? What does it make what does make this structure an investment fund itself? Is it the legal entity? Doesn't seem so. So you need to have a substantial approach and not a formal approach on what that structure actually is. The second standpoint that I think it's important to talk about this internationalization is, just like I was telling a few minutes before, since 2007, the Brazilian retail funds can invest abroad as well. So they can invest in securities, and they can also invest in other funds. When CVM allows the Brazilian funds to invest in these other funds, we always have to remember that the Brazilian funds usually send their monies abroad to invest in hedge funds. Hedge funds are unregulated funds. What you have is actually the regulation of the service providers, but not of the fund themselves. In Brazil, we have two ways of regulation. We have the regulation of the offering, just like we were talking right now, and you have the regulation of the issuer. The Brazilian investment funds are very regulated products. So when CVMs try to make some kind of comparison between the Brazilian fund and the offshore fund in order to allow a retail fund to invest abroad, CVM usually brings the necessity of regulation for these funds. But when we look at the actual universe that we are trying to invest abroad, when you think about these funds, you are always thinking about hedge funds and not the usual mutual funds that you have here. Because honestly, they are not necessarily interesting for the Brazilian managers. Brazilian managers, when they want to go abroad, they usually want to invest in hedge funds and not in these typical products. So this second standpoint is where we see CVM struggling a little bit with the market to understand what is an actually regulated fund from a CVM perspective. And here we still keep on the same challenge of, is it a company? Is it a condominium? Is the fact that you have X and Y service providers? Is the purpose of the vehicle enough to be seen as an investment fund? And I think that the third standpoint, the third perspective I would like to talk about is the most recent development that we had in the fund industry, and this I think is one that's going to mix all of our lives a little bit, is the fact that now the Brazilian private equity funds can invest abroad as well. So first we have the Brazilian liquid funds that can buy securities, buy other funds, but basically liquid investments. And now what we have, and in that situation, CVM was always trying to make the comparison of what is the Brazilian structure with what is the offshore structure. And now what we have is, for the private equity funds that also can invest abroad, the Brazilian private equity funds, even though they are not as regulated as the liquid funds, they have a few obligations of influencing the invested companies, and also a few demands on the governance of the invested company. That is the next challenge that we have to make this comparison, because now the private equity funds can invest abroad. They should be investing in the same way, with the same, CVM calls it, the same economic nature of the investments that they make in Brazil. So we are leaving this comparison of condominium versus company, condominium versus what is an actual investment fund abroad, and also going to the comparison of what is the Brazilian private equity with what is the offshore private equity. I think that we are now starting to see the Brazilian managers investing more abroad. The Brazilian fund industry has been developing amazingly for the past 10 to 15 years because it's actually the age of this industry. Until 2003, 2002, the funds were with the central bank, and it was a very smaller industry. So we have basically 15 years of CVM regulating it, and now the Brazilian fund industry, which is more than $1 trillion industry, is a very, very big industry, is starting to send its monies to the rest of the world. But we are still facing this comparison of a positive loss system, as we have here a very protective system, allowing the monies from the public to go to these more risky investments in hedge funds, in offshore funds, or even in other jurisdictions in order to allow private equity investments that may also be invested in funds. So I don't know if it's clear for everyone on what I'm trying to say here, but the idea is we still have not dealt with that. We still have not solved this equation, but how are we going to make a correct assessment of what is an investment fund abroad? And it seems to me that the way to go there is a substance way, is a substance approach. And we have always to remember that as Brazilians, the substance approach is a little bit harder. The substance approach runs a little bit away of our system. Just like what we have been seeing, and of course, I used to work at an asset manager which was SEC registered, as we have been seeing with the Dodd-Frank, where we have also a common law system having eventually too many acts for what we have always learned. So I think that this investment fund word is in the middle of this confusion, but also in a very, very good speed and velocity of development. So I have a very optimistic view of what the next few years, but we still have some challenges. And besides all of the market challenge that we already have, like the interest rates of the government being still more interesting than equities, we also have this legal structure challenge that for the investment funds is a very specific discussion that it doesn't seem it's going to be solved in the next few years, at least I think. So this is the update for the fund industry here.
Thank you so much. And finally, David, if you can kind of look forward and think we have a much better sense, I think, at this point about what the Brazilian capital markets look like now and the opportunities for Brazilian companies to raise money abroad. But in terms of what kinds of regulatory changes might lead to more efficiency, higher level of funding, and so on.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me today. It's an honor to be here on this distinguished panel. So in terms of, obviously you've heard today that the capital markets are quite healthy. There's been a significant amount of activity, but there's always room for measures that can be taken by the regulators to further stimulate capital markets activity. One thing we can look at is some U.S. regulations that came out of the last financial crisis for inspiration as to the types of regulations that could be effective in Brazil. In 2012, the U.S. enacted the Jobs Act, which is the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, which the stated purpose was to facilitate access to the capital markets for small and startup entities by easing the regulatory burdens on those entities. Well, there have been a number of provisions and rules that come out to that end, including one that's relevant to my practice and easing the restrictions on general solicitation and advertising. For purposes of the Brazilian context, two that I thought were worth discussing briefly were, one, the IPO on-ramp for emerging growth companies, and then the second, which Andre actually mentioned earlier, or the crowdfunding exemption that we have here in the United States. So first, in terms of the IPO on-ramp for emerging growth companies, it's a new issuer category that was created for issuers that have annual revenues of under $1.07 billion. They can maintain that status until the earlier of hitting that revenue threshold, issuing over $1 billion in non-cumulative debt over a 3-year rolling period. becoming a large accelerated filer, so an entity with a large public float, or the 5-year anniversary of their IPO. The advantage of this emerging growth company status is really there's limited disclosure when compared to other types of registration statements, which is really the burden burdensome in terms of expense and time spent for new issuers. So limiting what they need to disclose to the SEC. Examples are more limited executive compensation disclosure, 2 years financial instead of 3 years of financial statements. Another advantage is they have the ability to submit on a confidential basis IPO documentation to the SEC for their review. Now, this facilitates the dialogue with the regulator, and the startup entity or the emerging growth company has time to decide whether or not they want to actually pursue an IPO. So it kind of lengthens the process and allows them to kind of test the waters in terms of whether it's something that they want to really proceed with. In terms of crowdfunding, obviously the Brazilian regulator, it's a hot topic in Brazil, and the Brazilian regulators have proposed a rule on that point. But under the Jobs Act, they created an exemption for offerings done via crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is obviously using the internet or social media to obtain financing. By way of background, under the U.S. securities laws, any offering of securities must be done either via a registration statement or an exemption from registration. And they created an exemption for such transactions under Section 4A6, it's called. In order to qualify for this type of exemption, there's an offering limit of $1.07 million, so we're talking very small amounts here. There's also a limitation in terms of how much a particular investor can invest in a transaction or an offering of securities. That's based on the income and the wealth of the actual investor. But we're talking a few $1,000s. So these are small amounts as opposed to a large institutional investor, which you'd see in other types of capital markets transactions. The offering must be done through the internet with a portal that anyone can access and see the offering materials. There's a limited filing with the SEC called the Form C, which has information on the issuer, the business plan, things of that nature, but much less disclosure than you would see in like a registration statement. There's also an annual reporting that an entity using the crowdfunding exemption needs to do, but it's also a very slimmed down version of disclosure. So I thought those two were worth mentioning in terms of inspiration for rulemaking in Brazil. And the other thing they asked me to briefly touch on was the role of the BNDES, the Brazilian National Development Bank, in infrastructure in Brazil. It's been the primary source of infrastructure funding since I can remember. And partly because as a development bank, they were able to offer subsidized lower rates to any borrower. So it really pushed out a lot of the private sector competition in the infrastructure space. That has changed, and it should have repercussions moving forward in terms of, first, the BNDES has, their internal credit criteria has changed, so they can't, in terms of the level of participation they can have in a project, and the amount of funding available for financing. So we need to have more private sector participation in the infrastructure space. And this coupled with the fact that there are a number of large infrastructure projects which are out for bid, concessions, and with the limited availability of funding from the BNDES, there's obviously a shortfall of financing, which will have to be filled by the private sector, be it from the bank market or for people like myself who practice in the capital markets, cross-border, and domestic execution.
All right. Well, we just really have, because we're running a little bit late, a few minutes, but let me at least toss out one question, which is that I guess it's been my impression, traditionally at least, that most public offerings in Brazil have been of enterprises of average size significantly larger than the IPOs in the United States. And it seems as though a lot of the funding for those came through the 144A portion of the funding in the United States. And I think those two factors are probably related, that because there's so much reliance on U.S. funding from institutional investors, it's the bigger companies that are already known and where a market can develop without the full regulatory panoply of a regular registered offering. Has there been a movement in the direction of more local funding for smaller offerings, or is that something that still is the challenge of the future?
Sure. Why don't I start, and others please offer your perspectives. I think your observation is absolutely right. The tendency for I think larger companies to get access to international capital almost goes hand in hand with the fact that international institutions want to have liquid securities, and they want these companies to issue, larger transactions. And so in order to get the international capital interested in a Brazilian company, we are constantly advocating that they need to do larger transactions. And so you're right that probably benefits the larger companies and is less useful for the smaller companies. I think that trend is going to continue because there really is a premium on liquidity, especially as the market is reopening. International capital is focused and willing to participate, but they have to have that safety feature or liquidity to do so. Now, what I think is interesting and hopefully supportive to an evolution of this is that there are a number of domestic stories, in part companies that are already listed, that are able to do smaller offerings, and for those offerings to actually be supported primarily locally. A lot of this, I think the recent examples we've seen in the energy and power sector, and I think would apply to infrastructure as well. You can get a lot of those transactions done in smaller size and with local support, and you don't need to rely on international support. So I think it's just it's an evolution that will happen. It will take time, but I think increasingly, as these transactions go well, and as there's more buildup of local funds, be it hedge funds or institutional management of funds, they'll be willing to support these local stories, and international capital will be less important for that segment. I think international capital will always be there and supportive of the larger stories.
Anyone else want to add?
No, just
Great.
to add that I also agree with your views on Brazilian equity offerings. And I remember that some time ago when B3 was studying offerings for emerging growth companies, there was a study in this exact sense that Brazilian companies' IPOs are in a very higher amount than IPOs in the U.S. And since 2004, as I can remember, in the IPOs, more than I believe that roughly 7% is always subscribed or acquired by international investors, and I don't see this changing in relation to huge offerings in the short term.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much. I think this is a really informative panel. So let's have a